Okay, so it's the last talk, so I'll open up with a question and quiz us a little bit to see if you were listening earlier to Emma's talk. What resource did Dippy depend on that we still depend on today? Someone got it straight away. Water. That's what I had in mind. I'm sure some people could also argue air. Yeah, but I was thinking water, since that's the theme tonight. So the puddles that Dippy stood in are almost certainly the same water that we're drinking in our tea, coffee, and probably even in your beer this evening. So enjoy that. It's pretty cool. I mean, can't really beat it. So water flows across the earth and around the globe, flowing and cycling. And rain falls on the land, water infiltrates through our soil, it also runs off into our rivers and out to sea, and eventually evapotranspirates back up into the atmosphere. And this completes an entire cycle. But water also flows through our societies, and we depend on them for things like drinking water, which we heard about earlier, and also for other services like agricultural and food production, and other services as well. So the way that water flows across the Earth's surface and around the globe is influenced by natural landscape features like our catchment boundaries, the topography of our landscapes, the hills, mountains that we have around us, and also vegetation and soils at any given place on the planet. But how water flows and moves around is also influenced by how we change that flow, and by things like diversion. So we heard a little bit about it already this evening. We treat water, we move it around for us to be able to drink. We also move it for transport and for like channelizing and creating canals of our waterways. We also capture water, and this also influences where water flows. So we capture water through reservoirs and also for drinking water and other reasons as well. And ultimately, the distribution of where water flows based on natural patterns and also based on how we capture and divert water influences who, so in terms of people, have access to water, and also what species and ecosystems have access to that water. So one of the most impactful ways that we modify and change flow of water is through infrastructure like this. This is a weir. We also change the flow of water through a larger infrastructure, like large dams that you see here, which we primarily depend on for things like hydropower and energy production. But we also have smaller infrastructure in our landscape, and these are called road culverts. They're associated with where roads cross over streams. And I'll zoom in a little closer for you, because this is often the infrastructure that we don't know much about or that not everyone's heard about. But most likely, if you traveled here this evening by foot, car, bike, and you crossed over a small stream, you probably crossed over one of these culverts. So we've done a pretty good job of mapping where these large dams exist across the planet. So you can see a map of them here. The larger the triangle, the larger the dam storage area. And you can see that a large number of these occur primarily in Europe and in North America currently. But we also know that these large dams are expanding. So we have a number of them under construction and also planned. And a large amount of these are planned for tropical areas of the world, which you can see here. So what is it about these large dams that make them impactful? Well, it's the characteristics of them. So the height, the width, the general size of these infrastructure. Also the gradient changes that these cause in our waterways. So we allow water to set behind these large dams, which changes the gradient from upstream to downstream and vice versa. And also these dams alter flows. So these changes have negative impacts on our freshwater ecosystems, and because these dams are so large, they actually prohibit things from moving even in a downstream direction, let alone in an upstream direction, for species that are dependent on these movements for reproduction. So one way that we're interested in what's this situation with the expansion of dams in tropical areas. So we did a case study in the Magdalena River basin, shown here, in Colombia. And we were interested in what are these current dam expansion and planned dam expansion for large dams? What is the influence of this on freshwater fish species extinction risk in the Magdalena River basin? And there's about roughly 200 freshwater fish species that we looked at in our analysis. So when you look at a natural scenario, this is the Magdalena River basin, there are roughly 20 freshwater fish species that have heightened extinction risk based on how we evaluated that, which is they have relatively small range sizes, and it puts them inherently at high risk of extinction because they live in very few places. And then if we look at a current dam scenario, what happens is that the basin becomes more fragmented, going into 30 smaller fragments. And this results in 3 times the number of freshwater fish species having heightened extinction risk. And then if we look at what happens if we implement all of these planned dams in the Magdalena River basin, in addition to the current large dams that we have there, we further fragment the river basin into 60 smaller fragments, and almost 4 times the number of freshwater fish species have heightened extinction risk under these change scenarios. So we also looked a little bit further into this and wanted to know, well, what types of fish are particularly susceptible to these large dams? And what we found is those fish that are migratory, so those that have to travel longer distances and depend on movement for their reproduction, are particularly susceptible under these large dam expansion. And also, a number of these fish are really important for fishery resources across the Magdalena River basin. But large dams aren't the whole story. In the Great Lakes Basin in North America, we mapped, this is a map of dams and weirs, and we found roughly 7,000 dams and weirs and mapped these across the waterways in the basin. But when we look at road culverts, those infrastructure I showed you earlier, those smaller infrastructure underneath roads that intersect streams, 40 times the number of those infrastructure exist compared to the number of dams and weirs that we mapped in the basin. So when you combine those dams, weirs, and road culverts, it's roughly 1 structure every 2 river kilometers that could act as a potential barrier to fish that need to move up and downstream, and also to our water flows. Okay, besides the fact this is a really bad joke, why don't fish cross under roads? Any ideas?
It's too noisy.
Maybe. Why else?
Too dark?
Yeah, that's definitely a reason. Other reasons, those are 2 really good ideas. Other reasons are that these culverts, when they're under roads, can be what we call perched. So the infrastructure can sit above the river and create kind of a jump, an artificial jump that fish would need to make. And in a lot of cases around the world, salmon are an outlier, but most fish cannot jump up these heights. And so they become a challenge for fish to move upstream. Other situations are high flow. So these culverts constrict flow of rivers, so you think water's coming out in high flow periods, and then it gets constricted really tight into this culvert. It's basically like a hose shooting water out at the fish. So you have like giant amount of water flying into your face. You're not going to want to move upstream under those conditions. And the opposite conditions can even occur. So water can set behind the culvert. Think of it as like a little mini reservoir. Water gets stuck behind the culvert and low flow conditions occur, and many species can't move upstream because there's not enough water. So those are a number of reasons why fish don't cross under the road of these road culverts. But how do we then address this challenge? How do we start to understand and know where all these infrastructure occur across the planet? Well, I'm not going to go out and drive around and map all of these by car. Probably nobody is. But we have some really cool technology like satellites that provide us with satellite imagery. And so in my research group and with collaborators around the world, including volunteers from communities, we are starting to map where all of these dams, weirs, and road culverts occur across the globe. We're using cool technology like Google Earth Engine, so it gives us a global perspective, but we can zoom in here to Belfast and map this weir, and we can do that across the whole global surface. But in Wales, we're also using on-ground surveys because we need to validate information that we're looking at on some of these imagery, particularly in smaller systems. And through these field surveys, we're also interested in collecting better information on the characteristics of these different kinds of infrastructure and in understanding how different characteristics of infrastructure influence and might have an impact on different freshwater species. And we're working with communities, so trying to get a better understanding of individuals' knowledge and different knowledges that people hold about rivers and these infrastructure. And so using this finer scale lens, we're able to look at both connections and disconnections along a river network. So collating and getting an understanding of where all these infrastructure occur across the landscape does allow us to get an understanding of current impact of these infrastructure on our freshwater ecosystems. But as Jonathan mentioned, having this information can also let us look forward and be more proactive and consider what implications can these infrastructure have given that we know climate is changing. So how will these infrastructure interact with, or even not, these changing climate situations, and some of this is starting to be explored. So I just want to end by saying that our research team is bringing together a lot of different kinds of information, starting to understand where these infrastructure occur, but our goal is ultimately to make that information available and to work with communities to bring together multiple knowledges to identify how we can return flows that benefit both people and nature. And I have some cards here for everyone with Alocephalix, which is a native fish migratory species here, and some information about our group on the back if you want to keep in touch, that everyone can have a copy of. And I'd just like to say thank you, and thank you to all the people that contributed to this work.
Thank you, Steph. Had a particular liking for those fish drawings. They were lovely. Do we have any questions from our audience? Put up your hand. Yes, there's a question there. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm actually writing a report on this sort of topic, so I learned a lot. Thank you. How, at the moment, do you think our knowledge of how fish migrate, do you think the current fish passes that we're putting in are suitable, especially for things like eels and lamprey? Are they suitable for, with our level of knowledge, to help benefit the species?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I guess the short answer is we don't know really well. So we know that fish passes help things like salmon. Increasingly, we're doing a better job of for things like eels, that's for sure. But for things like Alocephalix, which is on here and also on the video that I showed at the end, that is proving to be a bit more of a challenge. And also, so fish passages with like the large dams, for example, have proven to be pretty ineffective. A lot of my colleagues in Brazil and in other areas of South America are starting to look at that. And a lot of these fish passages were developed in places like North America, where the systems might be completely different. The fish swimming capacities and abilities are very different, and they're not suitable to the conditions. So it's kind of a mixed situation, but we don't have a fully good understanding of what it all means in terms of the passability. Thanks.
Do we have another question from our audience? Put your hand up if you have another question for Steph. Yes, go ahead. Just a microphone down at the back, please. You're doing some job tonight, boy, with that microphone.
Steph, what would be your ideal outcome from your research and from everything that you're doing in regards to the weirs and the dams that are, popping up everywhere?
Yeah, so I guess it's always a trade-off, and I don't think that we're going to ever live in a world where we don't have dams and we don't have roads, because we depend on them for many services that they provide. But I think it comes back to the first question, is like, what modifications can we make to those infrastructure? Can we be smarter about where we're putting them and look into future scenarios, like how climate is changing, where we might need to store water versus where we might want to let it flow? I think we need to be much more savvy about how we're approaching these questions.
We've got a question over here at the other side of the room. Let's just all watch him this time. No pressure. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thanks, I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Is there any example of where something is done in a really good way, like a sort of target that you're looking at to kind of replicate?
So that's why I showed that video. So this is Seven Rivers Trust video. I don't know if I can get back to it actually starting. Yeah. So the Seven Rivers Trust is doing a lot of work to restore passage for particularly this species, the Alocephalix. But there's a lot of work going on around the world. Again, it's a challenge because in places like South America, they are trying to increase energy capacity for a growing population. And one way that they can do that is through hydropower. There's other ways of doing it as well. But I think in terms of a group that's doing great work in the UK, I would say Seven Rivers Trust. I'm going to meet with them in January and get to see more of what they're doing on ground. But they're trying a lot of different things, and they're working a lot with communities and involving school children. So I think that's a good start in terms of improving the way we're doing these things. Yeah, Jonathan.
Yes, go ahead, Jonathan.
That's really good. So what's their motivation for doing it? Is it policy? Is it the climate, the infrastructure needs?
So I don't know 100%. I have some suspicion. So we published a paper in 2011 which pointed out the problem of these road culverts. And at the same time, a group called the World Fish Migration Organization started, and now there's a biannual, every 2 years. Is that biannual? Yeah. Every 2 years there's an event to celebrate migratory fish. And I think part of the motivation for some of these projects is because of this World Fish Migration Day, access of funds, support through the Water Framework Directive, and active policies that we're aware that these fisheries declined to a point where the fish aren't occurring in UK waters, aren't occurring in French waters. So what can we do about it? And if it means retrofitting and modifying infrastructure that we aren't necessarily using, that seems like a logical first step.
Because it's almost more hidden than marine shifts because you haven't got full-scale commercial fisheries,
Yeah.
so.
We've time for one more audience question for Steph. Do we have one more? Yes? He wants you to do his paper for him.
Just again going back to things like fish passages with like weirs and dams and stuff like that, because they alter the habitat so much, is it even appropriate or to put a fish passage in when the habitat's been altered? Things like salmonids need the red sites to put on. So if those red sites aren't there, does putting a fish passage do any good at all?
Yeah, really great question. And there's a lot of things around that too. So it's one about suitable habitat, water quality upstream of those barriers, what's up there once we remove the infrastructure or allow the fish to pass. And also a lot of questions about what we call invasive species and what impacts like removing some of these infrastructure would have. And there's a fair amount of work going on in Europe now and also in North America to look at trade-offs of where we might keep some barriers in to keep invasive species out, but take some out to let native species in. And I think what we don't know is if we return these species, native species, how that will change the balance in terms of the ecosystem processes and the influence on invasive species that have been able to be successful under current situations. So, yeah, thanks. Great question.
Thank
I
you.
didn't bring him here for the question.
You did.
Yeah.
He's a plant. He's a plant. He came with you. Thank you very much, everybody. Dr. Steph, thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.